All right, so let's keep going. So we just looked at the connection between the state that's generated by the reducer, that it's on its way to the container, right? So the reducer generates the state, right? And at some point the container is going to get that state, right? Massage it a little bit, and then pass it along as properties to the component. Right? Well, who generates this state? We still need some glue over here. So let's generate this glue. So the last piece of the glue is to provide or to implement what is called a provider. Right? The provider is who's going to kick off this entire process. Right? Is going to say, okay, well, here's the reducer. Right? Once I have the reducer, I'm going to provide the reducer to the rest of the application, to all the containers that are expecting this state, who are responsible for extracting state and then sending it over to their components. Right? So the provider is going to be the last piece of this puzzle that's going to take the state from the reducer. Right? Is going to provide that container, that state to the container. The container will extract from the state and then send it over to the component as properties. All right, so let's keep going here. All right, so now at the top level of the entry point of our application, we have the index.js. Yes, in index.js we had a simple hello world. Right, we were loading the actual component. Right, we were loading the actual component and we were rendering the actual hello component. Yes, but now, right, because we're going to be using Redux, we can no longer use the bare bone component all by itself. It always has to be used within the context of its container, right? Because it is the container who's going to provide the state. Right? I cannot skip that because only the container will give it the state, right? Not anyone else, right? The only one responsible for generating these states is the reducer that is going to go through the container down to the component. So no longer will I access the component all by itself. Instead, here's my container. Remember, the container contains the component. Yes? Right? So I'm no longer going to use the component all by itself. Here's my reducer. I'm loading my reducer. Right? What else do I have? Here's here's some two. We have a provider, right? The provider is also part of the glue. Notice the React Redux, right? We're loading it from there. Again, it's responsible for gluing these two worlds together, right? Gluing the Redux world to the React world. And finally, we have the create store. The create store is a function that's going to take as an argument our function, right? Our own function, yes? And it's going to be able to create the store. And once it creates the store, we can then use it to give it to the provider, and the provider will provide it to everybody else, all the containers. Right? So the provider will take the store from our reducer, and it'll provide it and send it over to the container. So let's render that. Let's see. Right? Here's our create store. The create store takes the reducer. Right? It generates a store. Once we have that store, we can use the provider element to say what store is the rest of the application going to use. So here's where the trickle down of all the state flow into all the containers. I can have any number of containers. Right? They're all going to receive their state from this store. Who generates the state in the store? The reducers. So the reducers generate the state into the store. The store is provided by the provider into all the containers that live inside of the provider. Notice that this is at the top level of the application, right? This is at the top level of the application. And I can have any number of containers in here. They're all going to receive the same state from the top level provider. And that's most of the glue, all right? And that's of generating the store. The reducer generates the state into the store, into the provider, into the container, into the component. All right? There's one other part. The other side of this is dealing with things that change over time, right? As folks generate events, as they click, as they drag, as they type at the keyboard, right? They generate a whole bunch of events, and these events are what are going to cause the finite state machine to go from one state to another state, right? To transition between different states. Yes, all right. So let's handle events. So for instance, what I'd like to be able to do is that if at the component I have a button, an input field, or keyboard, whatever, I want to send that event, into the store, into the reducer. The reducer should calculate what the next state should be. It's not always going to be the same state. It should change over time. Yes, right. So how do we do that? Well, here in our low-level component, not only am I rendering something that is being sent to me, right, some data, I also I'm also being passed along some event handler. Remember, I'm not going to handle my own events. I don't have any state to change. If I handle my own event, what would I do with it? Right? I don't have any state to change, right? So it's not my responsibility to handle my events because I can't change any. I can't force any change, right? So what we have here is that we're being passed along some event handler, meaning I'm not responsible for handling my events. I will just notify you that something happened, but it's not my responsibility. It's very similar in MVC, in Model View Controller. You have the same pattern here, right? Components typically don't handle any of their own events. They notify some controller, and the controller is then responsible for manipulating the model and doing everything else. Yes? Same thing here. The views are dumb. They're being passed the data that need to render, and then they just notify events that happen to someone else. Yes? Right, so in that sense, it's very, very similar to what you would do if there was an MVC design pattern here, right? So you just pass me a callback, and I'll just call you to notify you that, yes, somebody clicked it. Somebody clicked this button. All right. Now, in the reducer, now remember our reducer first always returned the same thing. Right? Return this one hard-coded JSON object. Yes? Right? Because there was no events happening. Nothing was happening. Why would I ever transition anywhere? If nothing was happening. But now I do have, right? Users can click yes, no, right? True, false. They can do whatever, right? Plus, minus. So now we can transition from one state to the next. So to do that, my reducer is now a little bit more involved, right? Notice here was my original return of the message just being world. Yes? Okay? But now it's a little bit more involved, right? Notice that now it's a function. It looks more like a function, right? Notice that it has two arguments. These two arguments are the only two arguments that this function takes. They're optional, but they have to be passed in this same order, and they mean the following. They mean the following. This state is the current state. What state are we currently in? Right? It's some JSON object, right? That tells me what the current state is. Right? Maybe the message used to be world. Yes. And over time, maybe the state will be something else. Yes. Right? It tells me what the current state. The second argument represents some kind of action that occurred. Right? They represent that somebody generated some event, and somehow it got to me. Yes, and now this action, it will have some meta information in that action that will allow me to handle this action somehow. Yeah, right, to fulfill this action. So, for instance, the action object that is being passed as an argument here has a single attribute, a single required property called type. Okay, that action is just a JSON object. Right, and it has to have at least that one attribute, right? Type. You can have a whole bunch of other things tied to that object, but at least you have to have that type. All right. This type can be used to implement the state machine, right? The finite state machine. And here we have a very simple state machine, right? It has only two states, okay? And we drive the next state based on the type of that action. If the action was click, then we're going to generate this new state. If it wasn't click, then we're going to generate this other state. Notice the return, return, return. Yes? Okay. So if we only have those two states, we can only generate either one state or this other state, right? And that's going to be the result of this hello. Yes? And that hello is going to go where? It's going to go to the container. The container is going to go to the connect. The connect is going to go down to the component. The component is going to go down to the property. And then finally the property will render. Yes? So the rendering will eventually either show click or world. Right? So presumably the initial was world, and if I click the button, it'll transition to click. Yes? All right. All right. So that's on the reducer. That's on the reducer. Okay, what about we still need glue now, right? We know what the reducer is doing. We know that the hello component is generating some event. Somehow it's getting here. How does it get here? Right? That's part of the glue. All right, let's look at the glue. And always the glue is where we get stuck. All right, so how is it that how do we glue together the generation of the event to the we need to go from here to here. How do we go from here to here? So let's take a look at that. We do that through what is called actions and dispatchers. Right? So yeah, so the component is generating these events, this click event, right? The component is generating the stream of events. Just like there is a state object that represents the JSON of whatever the current state is, well, there's a function called the dispatcher, right? Whose responsibility is to funnel all these events back and forth, right? Okay, and that's the responsibility of the dispatcher. The dispatcher generates the action objects that presumably have a type in it. Yes? And that type will be used by the reducer to know which new state to generate. Right? So again, just like there is in the container, there is a mapper. The container, there is a mapper that maps a state, right? Maps it to the component's properties, right? Right? We need to do the mapping inverse. The container also has in its properties now has functions, right? That's going to call when you click on a button. Yes? Well, we need to do the mapping of those events that are generated into actual calls into the reducer, right? And that's what the dispatcher does. It maps the properties that are functions, right, that have names, into a standard invocation of what is called a dispatcher, and the dispatcher generates these actions that make their way into the reducer. All right, let's look at an example. Okay. All right, so remember the connect in the container, right? We looked at the container, right, generating the connect. We looked at the state to property mapper. Remember that, right? This mapped state that came from the reducer, presumably, right, and extracted, and it said, oh, this state element goes into that property. Yes? Right? But now the hello world, the hello component, not only does it have a message, right? Notice that we added, right? Not only does it have this message, which we already handled it, right? And now we have another property, right? This function. This is data coming in, whereas these are events going out, right? Right. So just like the state to property mapper is feeding us with data, now we have to go the other way around. We need to map events that are being generated from here, right? We need to map them on our way out, right? And that's what the other mapper function does. Right. So we already looked at the state to property mapper, right? That maps the data coming in. Now we're going to provide another mapper that's going to take the properties. In our case, is a handle click or something. Yes. We're going to map that to a function that we're going to call the dispatch. Right, so the mapper is called dispatcher to property mapper. Right. Remember the hello The hello has this handle click. See that handle click? That's declared on the property. What we're doing here is saying, hey, you see that handle click declared on the component? All right? All right? Well, map it to the following function. When that gets clicked, call this function. This is what this object does. It says if that button gets clicked, if that component generates, through this handle click gets generated an event, call this function. And this function will use a standard function, a standard call function that is called dispatch, to generate the action. Remember, the reducer is expecting an action? Yes? The reducer is expecting an action. Here's what gets generated. Here I'm generating that action. In this case, it's a type click. Right? Type click. And remember, the reducer has a switch that says that if the action.type is click, right, to generate a new state. Remember that? Right? Here's where the event, when that action gets generated. Okay? All right, let's go a little further. Parameters, right? So, for instance, when I, let's map another one. Here I have a hello, and on click, I'm going to use a different event handler. I'm going to call it set message, and our first event, the handle click. Notice that it wasn't passing any data. It wasn't passing any data. Yeah, I'm just generating the click. I'm just telling somebody clicked. Right? Let's make it just a little more interesting. That I can pass parameters along. From here, from down in the lowly component, I can send information out. Not only can I receive information coming from the outside, but I can also call a function and pass data going out. Yes? Maybe an input field that I filled out. Yes? Or maybe a button that I'm deleting this element and not that element with the ID of the element that I'm removing. Yes? So I can pass in data outside. So here, if I click on this button, right? I believe there was 2 buttons. Then I'm going to call set message, and I'm passing as an argument Alice. Okay? And this set message, again, we're not handling anything here. Somebody's passing us a callback that we can call out. Yes? That needs to be mapped. So to map it, we go back to the dispatch it to property mapper. We already mapped that the first button, right? The first button just generates a click. The second button calls this set message, notice that the first one, the click, the handle click, calls this function, but it has no arguments. Right? It just calls the function. This one, when it calls this function, actually it passes something along. In this case, it's passing Alice. Yes? Right? And here's Alice is now bound to this attribute, right? To this argument that gets passed into the dispatcher, right? We're adding a brand new type of action. We're saying that the type of this action is set message, comma. So type is the only required property here. It's the only required property, right, of any action that I generate, right? Any other properties that I put in this object are all optional, right? They only mean something to me. They mean something to my application, right? In our particular case is that I am passing along the message, right, as an attribute called message into the action, right? Now, so this will reach the reducer. The reducer, it says, okay, I have another event type, set message. So if the action type is message, set message, okay, I can read the message from the message attribute that you have included in the action that you just generated. Right? Your action doesn't only contain the type, right? It doesn't only contain the type. It also contains any other additional fields that allow me to customize my action, right, of handling that object, that data. Okay, right. All right, that concludes the Hello World Redux demo. Right, this is the simplest possible example I can think of. And nevertheless, there was quite a lot here, right? There was way, way, way too much. But most of what probably you're scratching your heads over is all this glue, right? Of going back of these dispatchers, these mappers, going back and forth, right? This will only become secondhand if you just practice it, right? You have to practice it doing these really simple, trivial ones until you see the pattern, right? Of all the glue. So there's no way around it. You have to practice it, okay? And once you practice a couple of times, right, it'll start saying, oh, okay, I see what's going on here, right? But there's no way around it. We have to practice it. So let's practice another one.